The thing about Corporal Danny Reyes was that she never did anything halfway, not even the things she shouldn't have done at all. That's what Lieutenant Voss kept saying in the debrief anyway, kept saying it like it explained something. Like the phrase, she never did anything halfway, was a cause, and not a symptom of the whole catastrophic, beautiful, unprecedented mess that had started at 3:14 hours in a sub-basement on a dead moon called Vashara 9, and ended, if you could call it ending, with the gate still open and something old, something patient, something with eyes that didn't blink staring back through it at the surviving members of Recon Squad Ember. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 3 months before the gate, Danny Reyes was filling out maintenance forms in the bunkroom of the UEF survey frigate Calliope and thinking about how boring her life had become. She was 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches of lean muscle and bad posture, with grease under her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing quite removed, and a habit of chewing the end of her stylus when she was thinking. She had a scar that ran from her left eyebrow to her temple, a gift from a collapsed scaffold on Meridian Station, and she wore it without ceremony, the way you wear a thing that happened to you rather than a thing you chose. She was the squad's tech specialist, which in practice meant she fixed things. Sensors, environmental systems, extraction equipment, the coffee dispenser that Sergeant Halco had broken for the 3rd time in 2 months by forcing it to brew at temperatures it wasn't rated for. She fixed things. She filed reports about things she'd fixed, and she went on survey runs that turned up nothing but rock samples and atmospheric readings, and the occasional microbial colony that the science team got briefly excited about before determining it was inert. She had, in a word, stagnated. She didn't say this to anyone. Halco wouldn't have understood. He was content, genuinely content, in a way that Danny sometimes envied and sometimes found quietly maddening. Private Os talked about the pension. Private Chun had a boyfriend on the Kepler station and spent his free hours composing very long messages to him. These were good people. These were her people. But the restlessness in Danny's chest had no name she could give it and no remedy she could see. And so she chewed her stylus and filled out forms and tried not to think too hard about the fact that she was 26 years old. And the most interesting thing she'd done in the past 8 months was rewire a secondary coolant relay using a belt buckle and a piece of copper wire salvaged from a blown comms panel. She was very good at that kind of thing. She'd been good at it since childhood, this particular variety of patience, the kind that doesn't feel like waiting because it's actively engaged, moving through a system not to fix it from outside but to understand it from within. Her father had called it reading. He'd been an electrician on a deep-water platform, and he'd talked about machines the way some people talked about people, with respect for their interior logic, with curiosity about why they made the choices they made. She'd inherited this from him. She'd also inherited his bad posture and his tendency to stay too long at jobs that had stopped being interesting. And she recognized both failures in herself without finding a clean solution to either. The assignment to Vashara 9 came down on a Tuesday. The briefing was routine. Vashara 9 was a geologically stable moon, moderate gravity, nitrogen-argon atmosphere, no surface life, standard survey parameters. There was a pre-existing structure listed in the Colonial Registry as Site V9 Theta that a prospecting drone had flagged 6 years ago and that no one had gotten around to examining in detail. The site was roughly 40 meters below the surface, accessed through a natural fissure that the drone survey had mapped adequately but not thoroughly. Recon Squad Ember was to descend, document, collect samples, and return. Estimated duration, 12 hours. Danny listened to the briefing and thought, this is the same as every other briefing. She was wrong, but she didn't know it yet. The descent into the fissure took 2 hours. The rock walls were dark basalt threaded with pale mineral veins that caught their helmet lights and threw them back in cold, fractured angles. Halco went first, as he always did, a big, deliberate man who moved through space like he owned it, boots finding purchase on every surface with an ease that made the descent look easier than it was. He had 12 years on Danny, and a sergeant's instinct for the weight of a situation that she'd come to rely on without quite admitting it. Osei followed, then Chun, and Danny came last, her equipment pack riding heavy on her shoulders, her free hand trailing along the rock wall and reading its texture through her glove. They talked, the way you do on descents, to fill the dark with something human. Chun told the story of his first field assignment, which involved a cracked habitat seal and an innovative repair solution involving a meal pack lid and 30 meters of wound wire, and which ended with his sergeant giving him a citation for ingenuity and also a dressing down for not following protocol, and which he told as a single breath of a sentence because that was how it had felt at the time. All of it one continuous event with no pause between the crisis and the outcome. Osei listened and nodded at the right moments. Halko made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but acknowledged that the story had been worth telling. Danny listened and thought about the rock wall under her hand and the dark below, and the survey maps, which she'd memorized the way she always memorized maps. There was a chamber. The drone had found it, had given it dimensions, 60 by 40 meters, height variable, unknown material in the far wall, and had moved on without going further. The Colonial Registry had logged it as anomalous and pending investigation, and nobody had gotten around to the investigation, because there were 47 other pending investigations in the survey queue, and Vashara 9 was cold, and had no commercial potential, and the unknown material in the far wall was a very minor notation at the bottom of a document that very few people had read all the way through. She had read it all the way through. She had read it on her bunk 2 nights before departure, with a cup of cooling tea going cold beside her, and she'd gotten to the notation about the far wall material, and she'd sat with it for a moment and then read it again. Unknown material, no match in spectral database. Temperature differential versus ambient, -2 degrees Celsius. Temperature differential is persistent. All 17 drone readings taken at intervals over 6-hour survey window showed same result. Something in a rock wall on a dead moon was consistently 2 degrees cooler than its surroundings for 6 hours, and nobody had thought that was particularly interesting. Danny had thought it was particularly interesting. The structure when they reached it was wrong. Not wrong in a way she could articulate immediately. Wrong in the way a room is wrong when you've been away and something has been moved, not obviously, not dramatically, but in some subtle rearrangement of the angles that registers before the eye can catch it. The walls of the chamber were too smooth. Not polished smooth, not machine smooth, but smooth the way water-carved stone is smooth, except that no water had ever run through Vashara 9 geology. The smoothness was the first thing. The second thing was the markings. They covered the walls floor to ceiling, dense and systematic, in a script that bore no relationship to any notation in the Colonial Registry's database. Not the pictographic records of the Keth ruins on Meridian, not the mathematical sequences of the Voreth deep sites on the outer belt, not anything cataloged or cross-referenced or assigned a classification number. It was its own thing. It moved across the walls in columns that curved very slightly outward, like text printed on the inside of a sphere. The characters, if they were characters, if they were even a writing system in the sense that implied discrete units of meaning, had a quality of density to them, as though each individual mark was doing more work than any single character ought to do. Layered, she thought. Compressed. Survey team recording, Halko said into his comm, and his voice was flat and professional in the way it got when he was holding something back. We have an anomalous pre-existing structure. Dimensions approximately 60 by 40 meters, height approximately 12 meters at the apex. Unknown script notation covering approximately 80% of available wall surface. No apparent exit other than the fissure we descended through. Copy that, came the Calliope's response. Document and proceed. Science team is very interested. Danny moved along the wall, scanning. She ran the script through her translator's pre-match algorithm, which compared visual inputs against 847 known xenolinguistic forms. The algorithm ran for 43 seconds, longer than it had ever run for any of the alien samples she'd thrown at it, and returned a single result. No match found. She ran it again, same result. She lowered the scanner and looked at the wall with her own eyes and thought, Of course there's no match. Whatever made this wasn't in any of the 847 databases because whatever made this had come before all of them, and the script wasn't a communication between users of the same language. It was something more fundamental than that. It was something built for the long silence between one civilization and whatever might arrive after. That was interesting. She had moved deeper into the chamber, toward the far wall, still scanning when she saw the gate. It stood in the center of the far wall, framed by a recessed arch cut directly into the rock. It was approximately 2 meters high and 1 meter wide. Its surface was unlike the surrounding stone, darker, with a quality to it that Danny's eye kept sliding off of, the way your eye slides off a light source that's too bright. It wasn't bright. It was the opposite of bright. It seemed to absorb the beam of her helmet lamp and give nothing back. She thought of a material scientist she'd met at a conference on Kepler, who described a theoretical metamaterial designed to capture nearly all incident light, and how the scientist had described the visual effect as like staring at a shape that isn't quite there. This was like that, a shape that wasn't quite there. It was sealed. You could see the ceiling, a single horizontal line bisecting the surface at what would have been waist height, like a door that had been closed, and then filled with something. And then the seam had been run over with whatever served as mortar in a civilization that built in a language with no matches in 847 databases. Sergeant, Danny said. Halko came. He stood beside her and looked at the gate for a long moment. That's a door, he said. Yes. What's behind it? Unknown. He keyed his comm. Calliope, we have what appears to be a sealed internal structure within the primary chamber. Door or gate type, approximately 2 meters by 1, integrated into the far wall, requesting guidance. The science team's response was immediate. Document and do not touch. Copy, Halko said. He turned to Danny. You heard the lady. Danny heard the lady. She documented the gate from every angle her scanner could reach. She logged its dimensions, its surface composition. Inconclusive. Material did not match known stone or metal composites. Closest approximation was a vitreous ceramic with a crystalline substructure. But even that was a reach. The numbers were off by enough to suggest the material existed in a different category entirely. She logged its temperature, exactly 2 degrees cooler than the surrounding rock, matching the drone's 6-year-old readings with a precision that meant either the temperature differential was maintained actively, or the material had thermal properties so unusual that passive equilibration to ambient wasn't occurring. She logged the dense cluster of markings that framed the arch around it. The markings here were different from those on the walls, more concentrated, more deliberate, arranged in what appeared to be concentric rings around the arch like warnings or instructions or prayers. She was logging the final ring of markings when Chun appeared at her shoulder. Anything, he said. No match on the script. Materials unknown. Temperature differential of 2 degrees, same as the drone read 6 years ago. Huh? He looked at the gate the way you look at a punchline you've heard before and still find slightly funny. Looks like a prop from an old horror movie. Bit smaller than you'd expect for an ancient evil door. Maybe the ancients were efficient. Maybe. There was a pause. Go on, Chun said. You know you want to. I don't want to. You've been scanning it for 20 minutes. You want to touch it. The science team said. The science team isn't standing in a 70,000-year-old chamber on a dead moon looking at the most interesting thing either of us will ever see in our lives. He grinned. She could hear it in his voice. Touch it. I won't tell. The thing was, she hadn't been going to. She genuinely hadn't. She'd been doing her job, running her scans, being professional. The thought had been there at the edge, the same way the thought of stepping off a cliff edge is there when you're standing on one, not intent, just the brain cataloging possibilities. She was a tech specialist. She respected gear that wasn't hers. But Chun said go on, and she laughed, and she reached out with one gloved hand and touched the surface of the sealed gate the way you'd touch a screen in an exhibition. Lightly, deliberately, as if to say I see you, as if to say I acknowledge that you exist. The gate shuddered. Not much, not violently. The way a living thing shudders when something touches it unexpectedly, a flinch, a recalibration. The 2-degree temperature differential vanished. The material under her gloved fingertips was suddenly, abruptly warm. Raise, Halko said, from somewhere behind her. I didn't. The markings around the arch began to glow. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical sweep of light you see in old vids about ancient artifacts. The glow built slowly, grudgingly, like something waking from a very long and very deep sleep. First the inner ring of markings, then the second, then the third and fourth, spreading outward until every inscription around the arch was casting a pale blue-white light that had no right to exist in a structure that predated human space travel by an estimated 67,000 years. Raise, step back, Halko said. He was using the command voice, the flat, even tone that meant no more discussion. Danny stepped back. She stepped back 3 paces and stood very still and watched the gate seam, the sealed horizontal line at waist height, begin to spread apart. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing that stayed with her afterward, in all the debriefs and interviews and the long sleepless stretches in the medbay. It wasn't dramatic. The gate opened the way a very old lock opens when the right key is finally used, inevitably, smoothly, with the slight reluctance of mechanisms that haven't moved in a long time but remember how. The 2 halves of the gate swung inward on hinges that left no visible trace in the surrounding stone. Beyond them was a chamber, much larger than the one they stood in. The walls were covered in the same dense script, but here the script had a different quality. The glow from the arch was spreading, and in the new light you could see that the inscriptions on the inner chamber walls were accompanied by something the outer walls didn't have. Images. Not clear, not photographic, not exactly pictographic either. They existed in the space between symbol and image, in the way that very old art exists, when the people making it weren't thinking about the distinction. But you could see figures in them. Large figures, bipedal with proportions that were close to human but not quite, too many joints in the arms, a skull that was wider at the base than at the crown, eyes that were set in the image with a density and weight that didn't behave the way eyes behave in art, looking down instead of up, regarding instead of posing. The figures in the images were always still, always in the posture of something waiting, not something acting. Whatever the original builders had believed about themselves, they had believed that waiting was the more important posture. The active stance, the doing stance, those were for the figures in the images who were smaller, who arrived, who reached. And in the center of the inner chamber, standing absolutely still, was the Sentinel. It was 8 feet tall. It stood on 2 legs, the same wide-based, over-jointed legs as in the images, with the stillness of something that has been standing for a very long time and has no particular objection to standing longer. Its surface was not quite stone and not quite metal, the same dark material as the gate, the same ice-sliding quality. Its arms hung at its sides, over-jointed, with 3 elbows instead of 1, the last joint bending the hands at an angle that looked wrong until you traced the geometry and understood that the hands could reach in directions human hands couldn't. Its head was broad and low, the crown wide, and in the center of that wide crown were the eyes. They were open. They had just opened. You could tell there was something in the way they caught the light, the same quality of a shutter that has just released after a long exposure, that told you the opening had happened moments ago and not before. Not when the gate opened. Not when the light spread through from the arch. When Danny had touched the surface. That was when the eyes had opened in the dark, before anyone was there to see, and they had been waiting since. Nobody moved. The Sentinel looked at them. Its gaze moved across the four of them, slowly, deliberately, the same way you scan a room when you enter it. And Danny had the absolute certain knowledge, the kind of knowledge that bypasses reasoning and arrives already complete, that whatever cognition was happening behind those eyes was not simple, was not the processing of a security system, was not automatic. It was looking at them the way something very old and very intelligent looks at something entirely new. "Calliope," Halko said quietly into his comm, "we have a situation." The next 4 hours were a study in institutional chaos. The Calliope science team wanted the squad to maintain position and observe. The Calliope security officer wanted immediate withdrawal. Command, when they were patched in 40 minutes later, wanted both simultaneously. Halko held his ground, literally and figuratively, and in the end the compromise was: maintain position at the threshold, do not enter the inner chamber, do not engage the Sentinel, document everything. The Sentinel stood in the inner chamber and looked at them. It didn't move. It didn't produce sound. It didn't change in any observable way. It simply stood and watched with those open, dark, unblinking eyes, and the longer it watched, the more profoundly Danny understood that standing still was not the same thing as being inert. She watched it back. She watched it the way she watched unfamiliar systems, not for what they were doing, but for what they were capable of. The proportions she'd already noted: bipedal, 8 feet, overjointed in the arms, wide-based skull. The surface material had the temperature it now shared with the air of the inner chamber rather than the 2 degrees cooler differential it had shown through the gate. That meant it was exchanging heat with the environment, which meant it was not a statue in the traditional sense. The inscriptions that covered it, similar to the wall text but denser, applied in spiraling columns down both arms and across what might have been its chest, were not glowing, but they had a raised quality, as if they had been pressed into the surface from the inside rather than carved from the outside. Halko sat down at the threshold eventually. He wasn't going to stand for 4 hours if he didn't have to. He had a disciplined approach to comfort. You used it when it was available because you never knew when it would stop being available. Os brought water and ration packs from the supply bags without being asked. Chun wrote in his log, slow and careful, occasionally stopping to look up at the Sentinel and then looking back down. He wasn't afraid, Danny noticed. None of them were, exactly. The scale and strangeness of the thing had passed through the range where it produced fear and come out somewhere else. A heightened attention, a sharpened presence, the feeling of being very completely where you were. She kept watching. Around the 3rd hour, she noticed the second thing. The Sentinel's eyes moved. Not much, not to track movement. They moved the way eyes move in thought, slightly, involuntarily, following something interior. And the direction they moved consistently each time the micro-movement occurred was toward Danny. Not the squad, not Halko, who was closest to the threshold, not Osei, who was tallest, toward Danny. Toward the person who had touched the gate. She filed this observation in her running log and kept watching. And in the next half hour, she noticed the third thing. She was starting to understand the script. Not read it. She wasn't reading it the way you read text you've learned, following symbols to sounds to meanings. It was more like the understanding was arriving from outside her, the way warmth arrives from a fire not produced by her but real, not her knowledge but knowledge nonetheless. She sat at the threshold and watched the Sentinel, and the inscriptions on the walls became, not clear exactly, but present in a new way, like a signal that had been below the noise floor and was slowly being tuned above it. Some of what she was receiving was context. The Sentinel was old, older than 67,000 years. The date the Colonial Registry had assigned the site was based on geological data and was not wrong but was also not complete, because the site itself had been created as a monument to something older still. The builders of the chamber were gone. They had been gone for a very long time. They had not died in catastrophe. There was nothing of catastrophe in the inscriptions. They had simply moved on, outward and then further outward, and then beyond the range of what the word moved could contain, and the chambers were what they had left behind to mark the passage. Not graves, waypoints. The Sentinel had not been built by them exactly. It had been made by them, which was different. Made meant something more invested. Made meant intention had been poured into the object, rather than just assembled in it. Some of what she was receiving was intent. The Sentinel was not a weapon. She understood this with a clarity that unsettled her precisely because she couldn't account for the source of the clarity. It had been made for something else. It had been waiting for something specific, and the specificity had not been species or approach vector or security clearance. The specificity had been contact, freely given, without fear. She had touched the gate as a joke, as a lark, because Chun had said go on and she'd laughed and reached out, lightly, unafraid, the way you touch something in an exhibition to say I see you. That was apparently the key. Not the physical touch. Not the biochemistry of human skin or the electromagnetic signature of her equipment. The absence of fear. That was what the gate had been sealed to test for, not the correct touch, but the correct state. Something that would reach for a sealed ancient door on a dead moon in a dead chamber, and touch it with curiosity rather than with reverence or with dread. The builders had understood something about civilizations that reach the stars, that the ones who survive long enough to get there can be sorted, approximately, into those who approach the unknown with weaponized suspicion, and those who approach it with weaponized curiosity. And they had made their chambers to respond only to the second kind. She filed none of this in the debrief, not yet. At hour 4, the Sentinel moved. It stepped forward, one step, a single, deliberate placement of its right foot approximately 40 centimeters closer to the threshold, and then it stopped. In its right hand, which had been hanging at its side for 4 hours, there was now something it had not been holding before. A container, roughly cylindrical, roughly 30 centimeters long, made of the same dark material as its surface. Where the container had come from, whether the Sentinel had been holding it all along and the shape of its hand had concealed it, or whether the object had arrived from somewhere else, she couldn't say. It was there now. The Sentinel held it extended toward them on one flat palm. An offering, Calliope, Halko said, and his voice was very even. The structure has made what appears to be an offering. We are maintaining position. Guidance requested. The guidance from Calliope took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, the Sentinel held the container with complete stillness, arm extended, and the only movement in the chamber was the small, involuntary eye movement that tracked Danny. The guidance when it came was, do not accept. Halko relayed the order. Nobody moved. Danny looked at the Sentinel. She looked at the container. She thought about the warmth that had arrived when she'd touched the gate, about the understanding that had arrived in hour 3, about the clarity that had no source she could identify. She thought about the inscription on the inner walls that she could almost read, and about the concept that kept surfacing in the not quite reading, the same idea recurring in different symbolic forms, building like a refrain. Carrier. She thought about all of this, and then she looked at Halko and said, Sergeant, I need to speak with you privately. They went 10 paces back from the threshold. She told him everything, as much as she could in as clear language as she could manage, which was not much and not very clear, because the experience of receiving meaning that wasn't yours was not an experience that mapped cleanly onto words. She told him about the signal building in Hour 3, about the context that had arrived, the age of the site, the nature of the builders, the meaning of made versus built. She told him about the word carrier repeating in the inscriptions. She told him her read on the Gates test, not biochemistry, not species, but absence of fear. Halko listened without interrupting. He had that quality, she'd noticed it before, of someone who takes information seriously regardless of how strange the information is, who processes the data rather than the strangeness of the data. "You're describing a psychic connection," he said when she finished. "I'm describing something. I don't know what to call it. And your read is that it's not hostile. My read is that it was built to wait for us. Not human specifically, something that touches without fear. And the container. I don't know what's in it. But you think we should take it." She was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the threshold, at the pale glow of the arch, at the sentinel standing in the inner chamber with its arm extended, and its eyes tracking her with that same slight, involuntary movement. She thought about her father on the platform, talking about machines as if they had interior logic worth respecting. She thought about the coolant relay and the belt buckle and the piece of salvaged wire. "I think refusing it is the equivalent of arriving at a meeting, having the other party wait 67,000 years for you, present their opening position, and walking out without reading it," she said. "I think that has consequences I can't calculate." Halko looked at the Sentinel for a long moment. The Sentinel held its arm extended with the same unhurried patience it had shown for 70,000 plus years, and its eyes tracked nothing but Danny. "This goes in the report exactly as you've described it to me," he said. "I know. And if you're wrong about hostile, then I'm wrong." He held her gaze for a moment. Between them, unspoken, was the shared knowledge that Recon Squad Ember had been doing surveys for 8 months, and had found rock samples and atmospheric readings and an inert microbial colony, and that whatever was happening right now was the reason you took the job, the reason you went to the dead moons, and the deep sites, and the chambers with no matches in 847 databases. "Raise," Halko said, "document everything." She walked back to the threshold. She stopped at the edge and looked at the floor of the inner chamber, which was the same basalt as everything else, worn smooth in the same water that wasn't water way. She looked at the Sentinel's face, or what served as its face, the broad crown of its head with those two open, patient, tracking eyes. She exhaled once through her nose. She stepped across the threshold. Entering the inner chamber was not physically remarkable. The floor was the same rock as the outer chamber. The ceiling was higher. The air was slightly warmer. What was remarkable was what happened to the understanding when she crossed the threshold. It sharpened. The signal-to-noise ratio shifted dramatically, and what had been a slow infusion of context became something more like a conversation, not language exactly, not even thought exactly, but something in the space between them, in the exchange of attention, in the simple fact of presence. The Sentinel looked at her from close now. 8 feet of dark made material and open eyes, and the eyes were not frightening at close range. They were very old and very patient and very much engaged with the fact of her, this small human thing with grease under her nails and a scar from a scaffold accident and a stylus she'd been chewing since she was 19 years old. She had the impression not data, not logic, something else, that it found her remarkable, not impressive, not threatening. Remarkable in the way a thing is remarkable when it arrives and is both less and more than expected simultaneously. She reached up and took the container. The Sentinel released it without resistance. For a moment nothing happened. Then the inscriptions on its arms, the dense spiral columns she'd noticed earlier, began to glow the same blue-white as the arch markings, building slowly. The Sentinel raised one hand, not toward her but upward and outward, in a gesture that was so unmistakably formal it crossed every cultural gap without translation. the posture of something that has completed a purpose, the gesture of handoff. It held the position, arm raised, hand open, and waited. Something unlocked in Danny's understanding. A flood of it, context and history and purpose arriving simultaneously, too fast to process cleanly, like a download running at speeds the receiving hardware wasn't built for. She staggered. Osai was at the threshold behind her. She felt him start forward and she held up her own hand and he stopped. The flood settled. The speed normalized. The understanding arranged itself into something she could hold. The Sentinel was not the last of anything. It was the first contact mechanism of something that had been distributing them across the quiet places of the universe for longer than humanity had been upright. Not probes exactly. Not weapons exactly. Mechanisms of recognition. They waited in sealed chambers on dead moons for the thing that would touch the gate without fear, and when that thing arrived, they transmitted. The container held a record. Not data in any format that human systems could read directly, not yet, but something that could be translated, given time and the right methodology, a record of what the builders had been before they were gone, what they had understood about the geometry of occupied space, what they had learned in the long span between the moment they first went to their own dead moons and the moment they sealed the last of their sentinels and left. History, physics, cartography. Something that didn't have a word yet, but was related to the idea of belonging, a map not of places, but of what you could do with places if you chose the right approach. It was, in effect, a library, given freely to the thing that would reach for a sealed door with curiosity, given freely to the thing that had no fear of ancient and unknown things, given freely to the thing that touched, not because it was supposed to, but because a friend said go on and it laughed and decided the risk was acceptable. Danny held the container and let the understanding complete itself and thought, irrelevantly, about Chun saying go on, about the fact that the most significant moment in human history, and it was that, she understood it was that, even standing in the cave with 4 hours of sleep deprivation and ration-pack rations, and something enormous running through her nervous system like current through wire, had been preceded by a joke between friends in the dark. She thought about the coffee dispenser she'd fixed with a belt buckle, about the coolant relay and the copper wire. She thought, this is the same thing. The universe presents a sealed system and you look at it until you understand what it needs and then you give it that. You don't approach with reverence that makes the hands shake and the thinking slow. You approach with the particular kind of attention that her father had called reading, that she had inherited and cultivated and applied to every broken thing she'd ever encountered, from environmental sensors to secondary coolant relays to this. An 8-foot entity standing in the dark of a dead moon, holding out what it had been waiting to hand over for 67,000 years. She turned around. Halko was standing at the threshold with the expression of a man who has just watched his tech specialist walk into a possibly hostile ancient alien chamber and come out carrying something. His expression was controlled. His hands were very still at his sides. "Sergeant," she said. "Raise. We're going to need a bigger report." The return to the Calliope took 2 hours. The same route, the same dark basalt walls with the pale mineral veins, the same cold angles of reflected lamplight. But the walk was not the same, because Danny carried the container in both hands and the understanding was still moving through her, slower now, settling into something she could access without being overwhelmed. She would need to write it down. She would need to write all of it down, in careful and specific language, and then there would be people who would argue with her about it. The scientists who would want to study the container with instruments that couldn't read it. The command officers who would want to classify the whole thing and contain it. The psychologists who would suggest that perhaps what she had experienced was not contact but contamination. That perhaps the warmth and the understanding and the clarity were neurological events rather than received knowledge. She was prepared for all of that. She had grown up reading systems, and she understood that institutions were systems too, with their own interior logic, their own preferred pathways, their own habits of treating anomalous data as error rather than signal. She would be patient with it. She would be as patient as she needed to be. What she was not prepared for, and what she found when she emerged from the fissure into the gray surface light of Vashara 9, was the second fissure. Halko found it first 40 meters from the descent point, a crack in the surface rock that hadn't been there on the descent 2 hours ago. New, recently opened, the rock edges sharp and unweathered. He knelt beside it and shone his helmet lamp down. "There's a chamber beneath this," he said. "How far down?" Ose asked. "Hard to tell, 20 meters, maybe 30. Danny came to stand beside him. She looked down into the new fissure, and then she looked at the container in her hands, and then she looked back across the gray surface to the original fissure they descended, where in the depth of the rock an 8-foot sentinel stood in a chamber with its arms still raised in the posture of completed handoff. "There are more of them," she said. Halko looked at her. "This isn't the only sight." She kept her voice level, working through it as she spoke, the understanding still settling into organized structure in her mind. "The record in the container, part of what it contains is coordinates, waypoints. They seeded chambers across a significant range of space. 14 systems at minimum within survey range, possibly more beyond that." She paused. "This moon was the first. The one they set up to test the approach, to see what we would do with a single gate before we found the network." Chun looked at the new fissure. He looked at Danny, at the container, back at the fissure. "So we passed," he said, "by accident, by touching something we were told not to touch." "We touched a door," Danny said. "We touched a door," he repeated, and the way he said it, flat, thoroughly bemused, slightly awed, the voice of a man who would be telling this story for the rest of his life, was the right way. There was no other way to say it that would fit the situation. You couldn't dress it up and you couldn't minimize it. The most significant contact event in human history had been initiated because a corporal touched a door on a dare. Halko stood up from the fissure and straightened and looked at the horizon of Vashara 9, which was close because the moon was small, and at the stars above it, which were very far and very many and suddenly populated in ways they hadn't been this morning. "Calliope," he said into his comm, "we're going to need additional survey teams, at minimum 4, possibly significantly more." He paused for exactly as long as it took him to decide there was no way to ease into the rest of it. "And tell the science team to bring their best translator. We have a library to read." There was a silence on the comm that lasted about 5 seconds longer than any silence on a military comm system should last. Then, "Calliope copies." "Say again, Sergeant, did you say library?" "That's correct." Another silence. "Copy that, Calliope out." On the gray surface of Vashara 9, in the thin nitrogen-argon air that no human had breathed before 6 hours ago, Recon Squad Ember stood and looked at the stars and said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be insufficient. There was only the container in Danny's hands and the weight of what was in it, and the new fissure at their feet and the understanding, arriving slowly, in the way that enormous things arrive, not all at once but in stages, each stage larger than you expected, that this was the first page of something very long. Danny thought about the inscription above the gate's arch, the outermost ring of markings, the one she'd been scanning when Chun made the joke. She'd been running translation attempts on those for 20 minutes before the touch, and the algorithm had returned no match, and she'd formed a loose hypothesis about their function, a title perhaps, a header, a label for the chamber's contents and purpose. She thought she knew now what the outermost inscription said. It said, more or less, "For the one who is not afraid." Not the one who is brave. Brave implied overcoming, implied that fear was present and subdued. Not that. For the one in whom, when they arrive at a sealed door on a dead moon, the operational response is curiosity rather than caution. for the one who does not feel the need to be afraid of old things. She turned the container over in her hands. The material was warm, body temperature warm, as if it had always been waiting to be held. The weight of it was wrong for its size, lighter than it should be, as if the object had a different relationship to mass than ordinary matter. She would document that too. She would document all of it. She was going to be writing reports for the rest of her life, and she found, standing on the gray surface of a dead moon with a library in her hands and 14 sealed chambers waiting in the dark below her feet, that she didn't mind. There were worse ways to spend a life than being the person who wrote down the moment everything changed. The return shuttle from the Calliope came down 40 minutes later, kicking up a plume of gray dust as it settled. Its navigation lights looked very small and very human and very bright against the dark, and Danny watched it come and thought about the bunkroom on the Calliope where she'd been filling out maintenance forms 3 months ago, thinking about how boring her life had become. She thought about the restlessness in her chest that had had no name, and how she hadn't known what it was looking for, and how that was sometimes the best way to look for something. The shuttle landed. The ramp came down. Halko went first, as he always did, big and deliberate, boots finding purchase, moving through space like he owned it. Osai followed, then Chun, who paused at the top of the ramp and looked back at the surface, and then at Danny and said nothing because there was still nothing to say, and went inside. Danny came last. She stood at the top of the ramp for a moment and turned around and looked at the gray surface and the thin star-scattered sky, and the place where the fissure was, and beyond it the new fissure, and beyond that the horizon where 14 other moons existed in 14 other systems with sealed chambers in their rock, with sentinels standing in their dark with their eyes open, having already opened their eyes the moment she touched the gate. All of them linked in a network that had been patient for 67,000 years and was no longer waiting. She thought about what was standing in the inner chamber right now in the dark with its arms still raised, what it had been made for, what it had been made to feel, if feel was the right word, when the waiting was over. She thought, I hope it was worth the wait. She thought, we're very strange, the thing that arrived. We're small and we smell like machinery and we argue about everything and we touch things we've been told not to touch. We got here by a completely accidental chain of decisions that could have gone differently at about 40 different points. We didn't arrive with reverence. We arrived with ration packs and a joke. She thought maybe that's the point. She turned around and walked up the ramp, and the shuttle door closed behind her. In the chamber on Vashara 9, in the dark and the silence and the slow glow of the markings, the Sentinel held its arm raised. Its eyes did not close. They were still open 2 hours later when the first survey team descended through the new fissure into the first of the other chambers, where another gate stood sealed in another arch wrapped in concentric rings of text, and one of the surveyors, a young engineer named Tors, 23 years old, who had been told explicitly not to touch anything, and who had that same particular quality of unafraid curiosity that gets people into trouble, and also sometimes changes everything, looked at the gate and thought about how long it had been there and what it had been waiting for, and reached out her hand. The gate shuddered. The eyes in the dark of the inner chamber opened. And the library grew. The debrief on the Calliope lasted 6 hours. Danny had been in debriefs before. She understood the format, the sequential recounting, the return to specific moments, the careful language of uncertainty that military culture uses as a container for the things it doesn't have protocols for. She had given her share of after-action reports, had sat in the standard issue chairs in the standard issue rooms and answered questions about equipment failures and environmental anomalies, and the times when the survey had turned up something that didn't fit the expected parameters. This was not like that. The science team lead was a Dr. Marin Solis, a xenolinguistics specialist who had been on the Calliope for 4 months and who had not, in Danny's estimation, been especially animated by their previous finds. She was animated now. She sat at the head of the table with a tablet full of the photographs and scanner readings that Danny had transmitted from the chamber, and she moved through them with the focused speed of someone who has found the thing they'd been training for and is trying not to move too fast in case they miss something. The container was in a sealed environmental unit beside the table. Nobody had touched it since Danny had set it down on the shuttle. There had been a brief and unresolved argument about whether Danny should continue to hold it. The science team wanted it in a controlled environment. Danny had felt, with a directness that surprised her, that putting it in a box was a mistake, that the transmission was still running and interrupting it would cost them something, though she couldn't have explained what. She'd been overruled. The container went in the box. The transmission, if that's what it was, dimmed but didn't stop. The questions about what she'd experienced were the hardest to answer. "Walk me through the moment the understanding began," Solis said. "It wasn't a moment. It built over about an hour. Third hour of observation. And you describe it as arriving from outside you." "I describe it as arriving without me generating it. That's not the same thing as from outside necessarily. It could be that the information was latent in the environment, and I was receiving it the way you receive a radio signal passively, in a register I don't normally access. I don't know. I'm not a linguist." "But you understood meaning, specific propositional content." "I understood context, and then gradually some specifics. The word the concept carrier was very clear. The age of the site was clear. The purpose of the Sentinel was clear. And the purpose was recognition and transmission, a mechanism for establishing contact and beginning handoff. It wasn't built to protect the chamber. It wasn't built to test capability. It was built to test approach." Solis was quiet for a moment, stylus tapping against her tablet in a slow rhythm, the parameter being the absence of fear. "That's my read." "And you're confident in that read?" Danny looked at her steadily. "I'm confident that I touched the gate without fear and the gate opened. I'm confident that the Sentinel tracked me specifically, not the team, throughout the observation period. I'm confident that the understanding I received, whatever its mechanism, included that information. Whether my interpretation of that information is correct is a separate question, and I'm less confident there." Solis nodded slowly, still tapping. "That's honest," she said. "I try to be." The debrief moved through everything else. The temperature differential, the surface material, the images on the inner walls, the container's anomalous mass, the second fissure that had opened during their ascent. Halko gave his account separately, and it matched Danny's on every point where they'd both been present, which she noted not because she doubted him, but because the corroboration would matter in the report. Command's reaction, when the preliminary report went up the chain, was exactly what she'd predicted. Controlled chaos followed by an attempt to establish order by establishing classification levels. The site was immediately designated a Priority 1 restricted asset. The Calliope survey grid was suspended pending review. 3 additional vessels were routed toward Vashara 9 at priority speed, one of them carrying a xenoarchaeology team that had apparently been on standby for exactly this kind of discovery since the colonial registry was established, which either meant someone had always known this might happen or someone had been very good at arguing for funding in the absence of evidence. Danny spent the hours between the debrief and the arrival of the first additional vessel writing. She wrote the way she fixed things, methodically, starting from the outermost layer and working inward, documenting what she knew before documenting what she thought she knew before documenting what she believed but couldn't evidence. She wrote about the script and the no-match result and the temperature differential and the surface material. She wrote about the hours of observation and the eye tracking and the onset of understanding. She wrote about what she had understood and how she had understood it, and what the limits of her confidence in that understanding were. She wrote about the container and its weight and warmth, and the way the transmission had dimmed but not stopped when they put it in the sealed unit. She was methodical and precise, and as honest as she could be about the edges of her knowledge, and when she was done, she read it back and thought, "This is the most important document I will ever write, and it is almost certainly insufficient, and I am going to write it again and again until it gets closer to sufficient." She submitted the first draft at 200 hours. At 300 hours, Chun found her in the mess with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a minute. "How are you doing?" he said finally. Not a question, really. The version of the phrase that means "I see you." "I don't know," she said. "Strange." "Yeah." She turned the cup in her hands. "I keep thinking about the images on the walls, the ones with the figures. The small arriving figures. Us. Or something like us. Something that reaches." She paused. "The large figures, the ones in the waiting posture, I think those are the builders, or representations of the builders, and the small figures." "We're always going to be us," Chun said. She looked at him. "Not human specifically," he said, "but something like us, the kind of thing that goes to dead moons. You don't build a waiting room unless you believe something is going to arrive eventually to wait for." He shrugged. "They believed in us before we existed." Danny sat with that for a moment. It was a sentence she was going to be sitting with for a long time. She picked up her cold coffee and looked at it and put it down again. "I touched a door," she said. "You did. Because you told me to." "I was joking," Chun said. He didn't say it defensively. He said it the way you state a fact that's also funny. "I know you were joking. And yet," she smiled, a small private smile that was mostly for herself. "I'm going to put that in the report, that the initiating action was preceded by a joke. They'll love that in command. They can deal with it. It's what happened." She straightened up in her chair and rolled her neck and looked at the gray walls of the Calliope's mess deck, which looked exactly the same as they always had, as if the universe had not fundamentally changed in the past 18 hours. 67,000 years, she said. They waited 67,000 years. And we showed up and touched the thing they'd been waiting for someone to touch. Without reverence, without ceremony, without a plan. "That's very human of us," Chun said. "I think that was the point," Danny said. The container was moved to a dedicated research bay. The science team began what Dr. Solis described as non-invasive preliminary characterization, which in practice meant shining a very large number of different wavelengths of radiation at the container and recording what came back. What came back was consistent and strange and unambiguous evidence of a crystalline lattice of extraordinary density and complexity that bore no relationship to any naturally occurring or synthesized material in the Colonial Registry's materials database. The lattice was ordered in patterns that Solis described as information-dense, not metadata, not signature noise, but structure that recurred at multiple scales with the regularity of intentional encoding. She brought this to Danny at 700 hours with the expression of someone who has run a result 3 times and is bringing it to someone else specifically, because she needs them to confirm that the result is real. Danny looked at the scans. She looked at the lattice patterns. She thought about the understanding that had arrived in hour 3, about the word carrier, about the sense she'd had of a library given freely. "It's written into the material," she said. "The information isn't stored on the surface. It's in the structure of the material itself." "That's consistent with the scans," Solis said carefully. "You're going to need to develop a new reading methodology. Nothing you have is designed for this. You'll need to start from first principles." Danny paused. "The understanding I received, I think that was a primer, a starting point, a set of conceptual keys that make it possible to eventually decode the rest." Solis looked at her for a long moment. "That understanding is in your memory. For whatever that's worth. It's worth quite a bit, actually. Solis set the tablet down on the table between them. I'd like to start working with you directly. Your account of the received content, cross-referenced with the scanned data, that might be the most direct route into the structure. Danny looked at the container in its sealed unit across the research bay. She could feel, even across the room, the faint continued presence of whatever the transmission was, not intrusive, not overwhelming, just there, the way a low note is there in a room with good acoustics. Yes, she said. Let's start. Outside, 3 additional vessels were already in approach to Vashara 9. Below the surface of the moon, in a chamber that had been dark and silent for 67,000 years, a sentinel stood with its arms still raised and its eyes still open, having completed the purpose it had been made for and waiting now for nothing, simply remaining in the posture of having given what it had held, in the way that something very old remains in the shape of the thing it was made to do even after the doing is done. And in 13 other chambers, in 13 other systems, eyes waited in the dark. For the one who is not afraid. For the one who arrives with curiosity rather than dread, with a joke between friends rather than a ceremony of approach, with grease under her fingernails and a scar from a scaffold accident and a stylus she's been chewing since she was 19. For the kind of thing that, when it finally comes to the edge of what it knows and finds a sealed door at the bottom, reaches out and touches it. The kind of thing that reads the system. The kind of thing that, when someone says go on, laughs and does.